Hello there guys, Hirosaki here. This story is all about what if Naruto was a trap master part 2. A wiser and more experienced Naruto is forced onto a team he hadn't wanted to join in the first place. However, as they say, those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash. Please like and subscribe to this channel before we begin, and check the description box for the author of this great storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 18, Chunin Exams, Kabuto the Show-Off. Inuzuka Kiba swallowed his nervousness as he entered the room in which the first stage of the Chunin exams was to take place. There had been some sort of logjam in the corridor on the second floor due to some sort of commotion that had been caused by a few Chunin hopefuls, but that hadn't been much of a problem for his team since Hinata had helped them negotiate it with little difficulty. The room in which the test was to take place was one of the classrooms at the academy. It had a somewhat different layout than the classroom he'd been assigned to when he attended the academy, however, as instead of the tiered seating he'd grown used to over the years he'd spent as a student, all of the desks were on one level. Adding to the somewhat foreign atmosphere was the fact that the room was completely packed with teenagers, all of whom looked older than him and his team. They were clustered in small groups and lounging around on the desks, chairs, and floor, and they looked to be from just about everywhere, Kiri, Suna, you name it. While a large number of them were just silently waiting for what was to come, most were carrying on hushed conversations, both spoken and in sign. Just being here just about put him into sensory overload thanks to all of the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells. Fortunately, he had his teammates to ground him. The Ino Shikacho team showed up a couple minutes after his team's arrival. With the exception of Shikamaru, who always seemed relaxed, they looked as nervous as he felt. Ino was twitching slightly as she surveyed the room and took in what he had minutes earlier, and Chuji was betraying his anxiety by eating at a far more rapid pace than normal. All three clustered together a little more tightly than they had when they first walked into the room, as if seeking comfort from companions they had known all their lives. Team 7 showed up about a minute later, making it the entire rookie 8+1 that had been entered into the exams. Sakura looked rather nervous, and both Sasuke and Naruto had serious expressions on their faces. Naruto, having taken the exams before, obviously knew exactly what he and his team were up against. It was still strange, however, to see such a serious expression on Naruto's face, and such a stillness in his movements. The Naruto he'd known at the academy had never worn such an expression, and had never been able to sit completely still. Naruto had been even louder and wilder than him back then. Sasuke, however, always looked grim. Practically the instant Team 7 arrived, Ino started molesting Sasuke, while trading what had become her usual greeting with Sakura since they had decided to become rivals over a boy that couldn't care less about either of them, instead of the best of friends that they used to be. Completely ignoring Sasuke's plight, Naruto exchanged greetings with Shikamaru and Chuji, who he and Naruto used to hang out with on occasion while Naruto was still in the academy. Sasuke himself pretended he wasn't being fought over by a pair of fangirls, and ignored, or rather pretended to ignore, everyone else in the group. Since everyone was here, he decided to lead his team over to the two other teams to say hi, as it had been a while since he'd seen them, and almost 2 years since he'd last talked to Naruto when he'd interrupted one of the boys' D ranks the summer after Sasuke had started his Naruto the Dropout kick. That, and Hinata had the damnedest crush on the Uzumaki boy, and if he didn't get her to say hi to him, nothing would. While he and Naruto hadn't exactly been friends, they had ditched the academy together often enough to almost be considered such, and the little group he, Naruto, Shikamaru, and Chuji had formed hadn't exactly been the same without him. Naruto had been the high-spirited Omega of the pack, and even though the boy had constantly challenged each of the others' positions in the group, he'd always gotten knocked back down to the bottom. Now, however, it almost seemed as if Naruto was the alpha of his own pack. After getting a closer look at Sasuke's misfortune, he exchanged greetings with the group of former classmates that he'd only seen in passing since the academy, as he'd been too busy to make much time to visit with them. Shikamaru mumbled a vague greeting, but then again, that was his style. Naruto smiled at Hinata, nearly causing her to faint, and Choji made one of his usual jokes about wanting to eat Akamaru, who had yet to hit his growth spurt. The dogs that the Inuzuka kept were much smarter than, and lived much longer than ordinary dogs, and would usually hit a growth spurt at around 3 to 4 years of age, during which they would rapidly shoot up to their full adult size. Sasuke ignored him as usual, and Sakura and Ino were still too busy arguing over Sasuke to really notice them. "Hey Kabuto. You failed again, I see," Naruto said when a gray-haired boy, or possibly young man as he appeared to be somewhere between his mid-teens and very early 20s, walked up to the group to tell them to keep it down. "Actually, I missed the winter exams because I was sick," the boy named Kabuto replied. "You know him?" Ino asked, distracted from Sasuke by the newcomer, who seemed to be the type that girls squealed over and called cute, as he had the even features of most males that were regarded as such. "Yeah, I met him during the Kiri exams. He's Yukushi Kabuto, medic, and quite possibly the next eternal genin. He's failed the exams 6 times so far," Naruto replied. "Next eternal genin?" he asked. There was actually someone who had really earned the moniker of the eternal genin? He'd thought that was an urban legend, like the clan of ninjas that supposedly lived in the sewers. "Yeah, the eternal genin's this really neat old guy who's been a genin since the days of the Night Aim," Naruto replied, and what's more, he could tell that the other boy was actually telling the truth, or had gotten way better at lying over the past 2.5 years. "I went on a mission with him once last year. He's a really good cook, and he tells the best stories," Naruto continued, looking slightly nostalgic. Most of the others in the group stared at Naruto in disbelief, as if they thought the more experienced genin was having them on. He almost thought that as well. It was just the sort of thing that an older genin would pull on the rookies. "Hey, you still got those cards you showed my team back in Kiri?" Naruto asked Kabuto. "Yes," the boy named Kabuto said, deflating slightly. It looked like Kabuto had wanted to show off for the newbies, and Naruto had just ruined the surprise. "Got one on Maraboshi Kosuke?" Naruto asked, grinning evilly. "Yes," the Kabuto boy said reluctantly as he pulled out a deck of orange cards with the kanji for shinobi written on the backs in black, and grabbed one from somewhere near the bottom. Kabuto then flipped the card over to reveal a blank white face, which changed to show information after he'd spun it around under his middle finger for a while. On the card, the picture of a man who looked to be around the same age as the Sandaime, maybe even older, was revealed. There was a listing of the number of missions the man had taken, which included over 2,500 D ranks alone. Next to that was a grid that showed his skill set, which was amazingly powerful, if he was reading the chart right. There were 3 other, much smaller pictures on the card, one of a boy, one of a girl, and one of a man with an old-fashioned haircut who looked to be wearing one of the early Jounin uniforms. "Maraboshi Kosuke," the boy named Kabuto said. Voluntarily remained a genin for over 5 decades, after making a stupid mistake during the Chunin exams, and getting his 2 teammates killed. Kabuto gave Naruto a significant glance after this statement, and got a cold glare from Naruto in return. There was apparently some history behind this, and he could tell that it wasn't good. It probably had something to do with the fact that Naruto had failed the exams during his first try a year and a half ago. There had been a large number of rumors about that floating around, and he hadn't been sure what to believe back then, or even now. After Kabuto had placed Maraboshi Kosuke's card back in the deck, Sasuke requested information on someone named Rock Lee, and someone named Gaara. Kabuto obligingly pulled the requisite cards from the deck, apparently still hoping to impress the rookie genin despite Naruto ruining the show, as Naruto muttered, "When'd he run into Gaara?" Apparently, Naruto already knew one of the people that Sasuke was asking about. "Amazing," Kabuto said after he'd pulled up the requested information on Gaara after a short lecture on some boy who had been in the spring cycle class and graduated 6 months before them. "A genin, and he's already been on a B rank mission. I got one of those on my record." Naruto said, not sounding too impressed. I caught some dumbass Chunin who was trying to steal from the Hokage. The old man didn't pay me because I'd been there to prank him, and because the damage caused exceeded the appropriate amount of remuneration for such a mission. Well, apparently Gaara's returned from all of his missions completely uninjured, which is more than you can say. Kabuto said snippily, apparently somewhat upset with Naruto for ruining his fun. After his little display, and a number of cutting remarks aimed at Naruto, Kabuto launched into a lecture on the exams themselves, and the countries that would be participating, making it obvious that he was completely shunning Naruto as he did so, which was pretty damn funny since Kabuto was an Omega type and Naruto had evolved into an Alpha. The lecture came to an end when Kabuto had somehow ended up in a fight with some ninja from a new village called Otogekure, and he got his ass handed to him after he had started talking about them. As the fight was coming to an end, the proctors finally made their dramatic entrance. Dramatic entrances had to be like a prerequisite for being a ninja or something. As he sat waiting, Naruto felt his leg twitching as the seconds ticked down toward the time when he would flip his test over and get started. As he listened to the proctor announce the rules for this test, it became obvious to him that it was information gathering like he had suspected. 2 points off for cheating. As Satoshi had told him when he'd visited the other boy this morning, the first part of the exam was easy for someone who had passed it before to get past. It was the second part that was hard, since there was no predicting how that could go. When they were in IWA, Satoshi, Suzume, and Kurosaki had to navigate a rather rocky arid region that wasn't quite desert during a heat wave. Their objective had been to find the other half of some object they had been given which had been hidden within a set area before another team could get their hands on it and make their way to a rendezvous point within 3 days. While the second part of the exams usually followed along the simple lines of survival in wilderness while grabbing the counterpart to what you were given before someone else got it or outright grabbing it from someone else who it was given to at the start, the real danger of that portion of the exam wasn't the unfamiliar terrain, it was the other teams. While he had the home ground advantage here unless they were forced to enter one of the closed-off areas that had been inaccessible even to him throughout his childhood, his team would be perfectly fine on the unfamiliar terrain aspect. It would be the other teams he would constantly have to worry about until that portion of the exams came to an end. While the genin from Konoha wouldn't kill their own, those from other countries probably wouldn't hesitate to kill them, and if even one member of their team was unable to continue due to injury, all 3 of them would fail the second portion of the exams. Eventually, the time to turn the test papers over and get a start on the first phase of the exams finally came. After he turned his over, he looked over the questions to see if there were any he could answer before resorting to cheating, since he didn't have that bit fully planned out, and he thought setting off an explosive tag and copying off the person next to him while everyone was distracted would get him thrown out, no matter how innovative it was. Crap. The problems were beyond tough. While he could probably figure out the code, the rest was beyond him. This stuff was high chunin, about to become jounin crap. It looked like he was going to have to catch someone cheating, and do what they did if it were a copyable method. He wouldn't be able to do this more than once or twice however, and he'd have to shift methods every time, because if he caught them cheating, then it was certain that the supervising chunin would as well. As he worked out his plan, he heard a small noise coming from the person seated next to him. He turned, and noted to his surprise that it was Hinata. He was so used to the girl these days that he barely registered her presence, unless she deliberately did something to gain his attention, which she almost never did. He knew that the girl had a crush on him since she constantly stalked him, hanging around at the edges of his peripheral vision, but thanks to Suzume who had experience in that area, he knew better than to approach her about it. He wasn't too bothered by her presence since she was nice enough, and he thought she would be a good friend if she got over her shyness, but he still didn't approach her. With Hinata, it was like Suzume said, it was like hand-taming a small bird. You don't try to force the issue as that would cause the bird to fly away, you wait for the bird to come to you. If you'd like to copy off my test. The girl started shyly, almost as if she were afraid to speak as she offered her test to him. Thanks. He signed in reply, as he quickly looked over her test and copied down the answer to only one of the 2 problems that she'd filled out already. There, that was one problem out of the way. Kabuto growled as his gaze landed on Naruto, while he was looking around the room pretending to be trying to cheat. The only bit of enjoyment he got out of these crappy exams was showing off for the newbies, and Naruto had to go and ruin it for him. If Naruto hadn't been there, he was certain that the newbies would have been properly amazed and intimidated by his display, especially with that little show he'd arranged with the team from Oto. In Konoha, he was merely a genin and not regarded as an example of a very good one at that, despite his status as a medic, and naturally had to take the exams in order to attain a promotion, since field promotions were very seldom handed out during peacetime. Despite the fact that he was ostensibly attempting to obtain a promotion, he deliberately through the exams every time he took them in order to gain information he otherwise would not have attained, or otherwise would have been forced to risk his life to attain through other means, as espionage was his true goal. Thanks to the exams, he knew the layouts of each of the hidden villages of the 5 elemental nations, and a great deal of information on the capabilities of hundreds of Chunin and dozens of Chunin. The exams themselves, however, were a pain in the ass, despite it being completely worth it in the end. In Otogakure, he was a Tokubetsu Jounin, and had gotten the rank the old-fashioned way, through the betrayal of his village. His true level of knowledge in the medical field was second only to perhaps Orochimaru or Tsunade, and in Oto, he got to show it off. There, he had assisted Orochimaru on a number of experimental procedures, and performed a few experiments himself. As a scientist, his hands itched to study a number of the people in the room, especially the 2 Jinchuriki and Uchiha Sasuke, who had apparently finally awakened his Sharingan. Realizing that he'd been gazing at the blonde menace while he'd been lost in his musings on the exams, he turned his gaze away from Naruto, and flicked it around the room in a logical search pattern. There. He'd found the plant. Time to start cheating. On the day I finally get Naruto onto my exam table, I'm going to forget the anesthetic. He thought as he started copying off the Chunin who had been planted in the crowd. Chapter 19, Chunin Exams, Into the Forest. Naruto knew that he had a loud mouth at times, a lot of the time in fact, especially in situations when he was nervous and his life didn't depend on his being quiet. Tetsuo-sensei had worked with him on it for 2 years, and had only been marginally successful in his efforts, as he no longer ran around the village screaming for attention at the top of his lungs. When he was on missions, or when he was in what Konohamaru had dubbed that mood, he was relatively quiet. Other times, however, his noisiness in manner and volume was a form of stress relief, as well as an attention-seeking behavior. The Academy got to experience this in the form of a highly disruptive prankster. His former team had got to experience it in the form of a rather rowdy and rambunctious boy who practically bounced off the walls. His current team usually got to experience his loud nature in the form of some rather vicious arguments that were usually between him and Sasuke. Everyone who took the Chunin exams that day got a little taste of it as well, when he decided to be confrontational, and refused to back down despite the proctor's best efforts to get him and everyone else in the room to do so. He'd been under far more stress than he was willing to admit that day, despite the fact that he'd been telling himself that the second part of the exams would be a snap due to home ground advantage, because he knew that they wouldn't be even with the home ground advantage. No matter how many times he told himself that everything would be fine, he failed to convince himself, especially after Kabuto had just had to go and remind him exactly why he'd been lying to himself, and ruin what little good mood he had upon arriving for the test, adding extra pressure to what was already a tense situation. When the 10th question came around, much to his shame and embarrassment, he had found himself seriously considering joining those who were opting out and running. His teammates didn't have nearly the experience he did, and there were a large number of people here with far more experience than him, and just as many with more experience than him, and his less experienced teammates who were running from the question as well. Considering how inexperienced they were, his teammates wouldn't stand a chance on their own during the second phase, and there was a distinct possibility that he wouldn't be able to protect them the way he hadn't been able to protect his former teammates and his comrades the last time he took the test, even with an extra year and a half as a ninja under his belt. Instead of raising his hand as he'd seriously considered doing, however, he had found himself rising to meet the challenge that the proctor at the front of the room had presented. He'd always hated it when people had had told him he'd fail at something without ever giving him a chance to prove himself, and that Ibiki jerk had been strongly hinting that that was the case. "Bring it on, old man," he yelled when he got the proctor's attention. "I won't back down, and even if I fail, I'll find a way to become a chunin, even if I have to wait 3 decades for a field promotion." Instead of smacking him down for his audacity as he expected would happen, the man looked around the room for a minute and smiled before informing everyone who had remained at the time of his rather ill-thought-out outburst that they had passed the first portion of the exams. Apparently, the 10th question had been a first-phase surprise. He should have known that the proctor was springing a first-phase surprise on them. That had happened the last time he'd taken the exams as well. During the exams in Kiri, the proctor had told them that they would have the choice of taking the old academy graduation test or not, and that those who chose not to take the graduation test would be sent home. If he'd been told beforehand exactly what Kiri's old graduation test had been, he probably would have been one of the ones racing out of the room as fast as his legs could carry him. The fact that his teammates had stayed had made him wonder for a while, until he realized that they had quite likely been as ignorant of the particulars of that test as he had. He was rather violently jarred from his musings on the nature of the last first-phase surprise that had been sprung on him during the winter exams in Kiri when one Mitarashi Anko, proctor for the second phase of the exams, made a dramatic entrance that would have normally scored a 7, but got an 8 for the sheer shock that it had caused when she had gone sailing in through a closed window, while the proctor for the first phase was giving a dramatic speech on exactly why they had passed his portion of the exams that had included the display of a number of rather gruesome-looking scars. Anko was the wild sort of person that looked like she'd be a lot of fun to hang out with. Too bad she was so old that it would look weird if they did. Tomorrow morning, they would be taking the second test, and he would pass this one with his team intact, or he would die trying. As Ibiki gathered all of the written tests, one in particular caught his eye. It had been the one belonging to the child who had challenged him, and inspired such a large number of teams to continue in the process. The boy had only answered 4 of the questions on the test, making him one shy of the number that would have gotten him disqualified. "Sneaky little bastard," Ibiki muttered, chuckling as he gathered the rest of the tests. He really should have thought this test through better. With the way it had been set up, a couple of brainiacs, and a few crafty little bastards like the Uzumaki had slipped through. Near the fence to the Forest of Death, Konohamaru grinned as the boss pretended to run away from his 3-person rock which contained himself and 2 of his classmates, Udon and Moegi. He jumped at the chance to interview the candidates in the Chunin exams for the Academy newspaper so he'd be able to wish Naruto luck before the second phase of the exams. He would not have been allowed in the area otherwise since it was restricted to all but the proctors, the Chunin hopefuls, and the Academy newsletter. His and his friend's dramatic entry had caused a great deal of laughter, especially when they had ended up choking on the colored smoke they had used because they had put a little too much gunpowder in the mix. The proctor, an awesome-looking lady with dark purple hair and skimpy clothes, looked about ready to yell at them, until they had informed her that they belonged there, because they had been ordered to do an article for the Academy paper. After the introductions had been gotten out of the way, she had given them 10 minutes to do their business and get gone. When he saw Naruto when he had arrived with his friends, his boss looked to be in that mood, but a few minutes of fun had picked his mood up considerably by the time their interview had finished, and they were forced to leave. Naruto had even introduced them to someone named Kabuto, who apparently knew a lot about how the exams went in other countries, and had a bunch of cool ninja info cards to show them, and to give them a foreign perspective on the exams. Naruto had introduced them to a team from Suna. The 2 boys were rather scary, but the girl named Temari was rather nice. Moegi thought she was cool, and Udon looked as if he had a crush on her. All too soon, however, it was time to leave, and when they did so, Naruto was smiling and didn't look as nervous as he had when they arrived. "Mission accomplished. Sorry about ruining your fun yesterday," Naruto said to Kabuto as they moved back towards the main group after seeing Konohamaru and his friends off. "It's okay," Kabuto replied. "Thanks for letting me do the interview with the Academy students." "You're welcome." He replied as Kabuto moved towards his team. They seemed even more impressed than my team did when you showed us your cards on the way to Kiri. As he made his way back to his own team, he couldn't help but stop and stare at the other Chunin hopefuls that were clustered near the fence that surrounded Training Ground 44. He honestly didn't know why so many of the teams had coordinated their outfits like Kabuto's team had. As far as he was concerned, doing something like that was a waste of both time and money. He couldn't have gotten his team to coordinate outfits even if he wanted to anyway. While Sasuke had gotten some shirts with the Uchiha fan discreetly stitched into the collar for situations in which he could go into battle, the boy would not budge on color, and only wore either black or blue. Sakura wouldn't budge on the color red either, just like the way he hadn't budged on the color orange, but was willing to wear more subdued shades if the situation called for it. When they made Chunin though, all that would quite likely go out the window, as almost all Chunin wore the basic shinobi uniform, and only really started varying their attire again when they made Tokubetsu Jounin or Jounin. There were always a few holdouts or exceptions though, and Sakura would probably be one of them. All too soon it was time to enter the forest. The release forms were signed, the scrolls were handed out, and the wait was over. After another brief wait at a gate, they were inside the one forest near Konoha that he had not yet explored, as a guy in a mask had kept him out of it the one time he'd tried when he was little, which mostly negated the home ground advantage he'd been counting on. During the first few minutes in the woods, he caught some moron sniffing around the team and sent the idiot packing with his tail between his legs. Things went well for the next few hours after that, right up until everything went to hell. A wind that was most likely the result of a jutsu split the group, and he ended up being forced to kill a goddamn snake that had to be the size of his apartment building in order to get back to his teammates who had been left like sitting ducks. When he reached his teammates, it was only to find some bitch holding Sasuke and Sakura under the worst killing intent he'd ever felt. Even though he was a little ways away from where his teammates stood paralyzed, he could barely move himself. Fortunately, Sasuke managed to make his escape with Sakura before the two could be killed. Had the Uchiha left Sakura behind, he would have murdered the boy, teammate or no teammate, Sharingan or no Sharingan. One of the first rules he'd learned was that you don't leave a teammate behind. As Sasuke and Sakura fled from the bitch who'd attacked them, he followed them, doing his best to keep ahead of another building-sized snake that was hot on his tail. He and Sasuke both turned and killed the snake after Sakura had been gotten to safety, only to have the bitch who had apparently been controlling the creature burst out of it in a demented parody of a stripper hopping out of a cake, like the one Tetsuo-sensei got in trouble for when someone hired her for his birthday party as a joke. The bitch whose Hitayate said she was from grass then shot up the tree the team was in, looking very much like the animal whose insides she had burst forth from in a way that was reminiscent of a horror movie he and his teammates had watched that had left him hiding under his bed for an entire night. They just barely managed to dodge this new attack, and when they did, Sasuke offered up their scroll in a somewhat cowardly, but sensible move considering the difference in power between their team and the grass kunoichi. The woman had been rather easily handing them their asses, and once she quit playing around, there was a good chance that they would die. While he lamented the lost chance to continue and possibly pass the exams this time around so he didn't start looking like the six-time loser Kabuto, who was only now taking them as a formality rather than out of any hope of promotion, it was better that they got out of there with their lives and limbs intact. They could always try again in January. The bitch hadn't wanted the scroll, however. That had been made apparent when she destroyed it before their eyes and threw Sasuke into a nearby tree, knocking him out. It seems that the Sharingan wasn't nearly as powerful as I was led to believe. The bitch said to Sasuke, who was just regaining consciousness after that rather painful whack to the head. Either that, or you are a particularly worthless specimen. Since you showed the smallest amount of promise earlier, however, I'll give you one more chance to redeem yourself later. And if you don't do so, you'll die along with the rest of your pathetic village when the time comes. Until then, Sasuke-kun. The bitch said before she vanished. Who the hell was that? Sasuke groaned. I have no effing idea, but thanks to your boneheaded maneuver, we now need 2 scrolls instead of 1. He replied. It figured something would go wrong, it was almost as if he were cursed or something. If they failed because of this, he was going to be taking it out of Sasuke's hide later. It had been Sasuke who that bitch who had destroyed their scroll had been after all. In the middle of the forest, Anko stood on a tree branch sore and shaking, as the seal on her neck burned. This was supposed to be a nice relaxing job, a break between more strenuous missions. Instead, she'd run into Orochimaru, who had been trolling the forest for recruits, or more likely, considering what usually happened to the people he got his hands on, even his own students, test subjects for his experiments. Based on what the man had told her before he wandered off, he already had an unfortunate candidate in mind. She pitied the poor child, and hoped that he or she could manage to escape Orochimaru's clutches before something irreversible happened, such as the seal she had been given. She couldn't stop the Chunin exams however, because they were all that were keeping Orochimaru entertained at the moment, and therefore keeping him from going on a killing spree and taking out anyone and everyone he came across. The genin in the forest were a small sacrifice when held up against the entire population of Konoha. After 2 days of searching following the debacle with the bitch from grass, Naruto found the perfect team to steal scrolls from. They had gotten both of their scrolls in the middle of the night, and instead of heading straight to the tower like they should have done, the idiots had settled down for a nap. Since they weren't from Konoha, he didn't feel the least bit of guilt over taking their scrolls. Fortunately for him and his team, Satoshi had taught him a thing or two about making off with things that didn't belong to him, and these guys weren't jounin, not by a long shot. The guy on watch had been half asleep, and neither of his teammates had woken up when he wandered through their camp taking the scrolls and setting a couple of traps to slow them down when they became aware that he'd done so and attempted pursuit. Idiots. After that, it was a straight shot to the tower, during which he took point in case of traps. There had been a great many blocking their way, but he had been able to navigate past them, going around the ones he couldn't disable. Shortly after dawn on the 3rd day of the 2nd phase of the summer Chunin exam, Team 7 arrived at the tower. Chapter 20, Chunin Exams, Preliminaries. As he stood before the teams of genin who had passed the 2nd phase of the exams, the Hokage shoved down his feelings of concern. Orochimaru had managed to infiltrate the exams, and they were forced to go on as if nothing had happened in order to keep Orochimaru from going on a rampage, and keep people from panicking until he actually did so, as the destruction they caused in their panic could be equal to or greater than any destruction Orochimaru may cause. While he personally wanted to stop what was happening, he knew that it would have to continue as if nothing were amiss. He gained a small measure of amusement from watching the shocked expressions of the genin, who stood below him as he explained the true meaning and history of the exams in which they had decided to participate. Long ago, this would simply have been taken in stride. Now, however, after so many years of peace, he was in front of a generation that had never experienced the horrors of war, and therefore were shocked by the mere idea of it. When had he gotten so old? Standing below the Hokage and beside her teammates, Sakura felt her heart hammering in her chest as a set of unexpected preliminaries were being announced. Out of the 13 potentially passing teams, 7 had made it here intact. 2 others had made it here not so intact, and had been disqualified. 1 scroll had been destroyed by the woman who had also swallowed her own scroll who had attacked her team on the first day. That meant that 4 scrolls and therefore 2 teams were still out there unaccounted for and unable to pass, because they'd missed the deadline. Because of the unusually high number of passing teams, a set of preliminary matches were going to be held immediately in order to further whittle down the number of candidates before the 3rd phase of the exams, which would be taking place in front of an audience of important dignitaries at some point in the near future. The proctor for this preliminary bout was asking if anyone wished to quit here and now, especially since there was an odd number of candidates. The answer as far as she was concerned was hell no. She hadn't gone this far and risked this much to back down now. While she stood firm knowing that she was close to her goal of becoming a medic and whatever may follow it, the older boy named Kabuto that she had met during the 1st phase quit at that point, making the group an even 20. That decision to quit had made it his failure record for the Chunin exams 7 for 7. Personally, she didn't understand why someone would go so far and drop out when they were so close to their goal. Why even bother to enter in the first place if you were going to do something like that? Soon, attention was diverted from Kabuto's recent failure and towards the electronic board that would announce who was fighting who that had been revealed. Moments later, the first names appeared. Sasuke was first off the bat, and he would be facing the Sound Genin, who had attacked Kabuto before the first test. Orochimaru watched in anticipation as the Uchiha boy made his way down into the indoor arena where he would be fighting one of his minions. Despite the fact that the boy had given such a disappointing showing in the forest, he had decided to stay and watch the preliminaries. He was giving his potential vessel one more chance to prove his strength. If the boy failed here and therefore failed to reach the arena next month, he would be as worthless as the rest of Konoha and would deserve to die in the invasion. He would not run the chance of severely weakening himself by pouring himself into a fragile vessel. There was still a question of whether or not this one was truly as weak as he had appeared, however. He wasn't entirely certain if it had been cowardice or pragmatism that had led the Uchiha to hand over his scroll 5 days ago when he had gone against him in the forest. Today, he would be able to tell which it had been. While handing the scroll over was a cowardly act on the surface, it was also an act of pointless stupidity to throw one's life away fighting an opponent they couldn't defeat for little to no gain, especially when what you desired could come to you more easily if you were prepared to wait. If Uchiha Sasuke failed the preliminaries, he would prove his utter worthlessness, and would die before he left the building. If he succeeded, he would watch the boy during the third phase of the exams and see how he compared to the strongest of his generation, especially the Jinchuriki. If Sasuke proved himself as strong as he thought him to be, he would take the boy then and there. If he didn't prove his strength to be superior, however, the last Uchiha would die, and good riddance. He'd never cared for the Uchiha anyways. They were overly proud and arrogant, content to rest on the laurels of bygone ancestors, and a rather treasonous lot to boot. The only thing he found even potentially useful about them were their eyes, which he had a clone stockpile of that he hadn't bothered using because he'd have to cover an implanted eye when not in use to prevent it from draining his chakra the way the Kakashi boy did. There were several other Kekii Genkai he could take if the Uchiha proved to be an utter failure, but the Uchiha's eyes were the one that would put him much closer to his goal of learning every jutsu ever created. The eyes would be useless to him, however, if they were housed in a weak body, as that would weaken him as well. With the chakra drain involved when using Sharingan eyes that weren't one's own, he would much prefer taking the Uchiha boy as a vessel than taking his eyes from his corpse, or using the ones he'd stockpiled when making Shimura Danzo's special arm, but he would implant them if left with no other alternatives. Instead of drawing one of the strongest available amongst the group of candidates that were in the preliminaries, someone who would bring out the Uchiha boy's true strength, so he wouldn't have to wait another month to see it, Sasuke's opponent had turned out to be one of his throwaway pawns that he had planned to use to test Sasuke's ability to handle the seal he had planned on placing on the boy, until the Uchiha child had proven to be somewhat of a disappointment. Rather than being a foil to test a newly acquired curse seal against, the minion would now be a secondary test of the power of the Uchiha child as well as his prized Sharingan. As he'd more than half expected he would, Sasuke had proven himself far more able with a foe he believed he had a chance of defeating, proving that his handing over his scroll several days before had been more an act of pragmatism than cowardice. There had been more than 4 days left before the deadline, and a number of scrolls floating around where the boy could get his hands on them after all. Why keep something that could cost you your life when you could get something just like it elsewhere and from someone much weaker than the opponent you were facing after all? After a rather short fight in which Sasuke proved himself to be superior to his opponent in every way, Sasuke eventually finished Dosu off with a move that his father had been rather famous for during the days when he'd served on the field rather than as the chief or police. As he watched the trapped Dosa burn, he found himself eagerly anticipating Sasuke's next test, the one that would prove whether or not the boy truly was worthy of his time and attention. All too soon for the participants in that match, the second set of names were called. Abumizaku made his way down to the arena floor a second after Aburame Shino. When the time for the battle came, he wasted no time in blasting the boy in the trenchcoat with his Zankaha. The boy evaded his attacks with relative ease, however, and called upon an army of bugs. Growing frustrated with his lack of success, he then tried to blast both the boy and the bugs only to have his arms ripped apart from the inside. He lay on the ground in unbearable agony knowing that he'd failed both Lord Orochimaru and himself. His technique had backfired on him, ripping his arms open to relieve the pressure because his opponent had crammed the openings in his palms full of bugs. Once again, he had been overconfident and tried to fly too high, and once again he had failed. He had failed himself, and Lord Orochimaru, who had taken him off the streets, and had made him strong so he would never again have to stoop so low as to risk his life in order to steal a crust of bread in order to survive. After his name was called, Inuzuka Kiba felt somewhat uncertain as he made his way to the arena floor. While he had always been able to defeat Naruto rather easily back at the academy, that had been over 2.5 years ago, and Naruto had changed a great deal since then. The loudmouthed prankster who couldn't be serious if he tried that he knew and skipped classes with long ago looked very serious at the moment. Instead of bouncing with excitement or trembling with fear like he would have been doing when they were in the academy together, he was almost completely still as they stood in front of the proctor and waited for their fight to start. He opened the fight with one of his better moves, a move that would have knocked the old Naruto out for days, in order to test the boy. Instead of standing there and taking the blow as he would have done back then, Naruto managed to dodge. At the very least, the Uzumaki's speed had improved to some degree since the academy. Deciding to try a different tack, he threw a couple of smoke bombs at Naruto in order to cover his attacks. Then, he and Akamaru launched themselves into the fight. Despite the disorienting smoke, they soon found themselves launched out of it again, heading in different directions with an explosive tag attached to each of them. Fortunately, the boy had placed a tag with a slightly longer timer on Akamaru, allowing him to save the dog from serious injuries, which had apparently been his plan all along, since Naruto went on the offensive while he was distracted with rescuing Akamaru. Before he knew it, he was on the ground and in pain, and Akamaru was on the ground on the other side of the arena. In a rather desperate move, he pulled out a pair of food pills. If he wanted any chance of passing, there was nothing left to do but pull out his best attack. And to think, he was going to have to use the Getsuga against the boy who had been touted as the absolute last of the class for a few years before he somehow managed to graduate the academy 2 years early, the boy he used to be able to easily pound into the dirt whenever he wanted to. After taking one of the pills, he tossed the other to Akamaru, but Naruto caught it before it could reach the dog and crushed it underfoot. Throwing another to replace the one that had been destroyed would be pointless, since Naruto would just catch and destroy that one as well. With the way things were going, he would have to hope Akamaru was able to distract Naruto while he did the Tsuga instead. Preparing for his solo attack, he threw another 2 smoke bombs to disorient his opponent, and Akamaru launched himself into the smoke cloud. After Akamaru jumped in to pin his opponent, he flew towards the boy, spinning at an insane rate, while Akamaru attacked from the other side. The attack failed however because Naruto had managed to shake Akamaru off and dodge his attack and counter it, even with the smoke cloud disorienting him. Still desperate to win or at the very least land a single blow, he flew at Naruto once more, and the result was the same. Eventually, after giving his best, and after several failed attacks, he was forced to admit defeat when Naruto finally knocked him down one more time than he could rise. Naruto definitely wasn't the Omega of the pack he remembered, but an alpha in his own right. After Kiba had forfeited, Sakura's heart leapt into her throat as the next 2 names came up on the board. She would be fighting Ino next. Ino, who had once been her friend, Ino, who was her rival for Sasuke's affections, Ino, whom she had been trailing after practically all her life, Ino, who was a beautiful cosmos flower while she was still a bud, was her opponent, and she would have to fight her if she wanted to pass the exams so she could be free to become a medic. Back when they were in the academy together, Ino had defeated her in just about everything but academics. Ino had trounced her during their taijutsu spars and outperformed her in the womanly arts. Ino had beat her then, and would quite likely beat her now. Even though she was afraid to face her, she would have to, since the other girl was standing in the way of her future. She would have to defeat Ino, who had always been better than her, in order to move forward. Swallowing down her nervousness, she made her way to the arena floor. She would have to get past her fear and give it her all and pray that it was enough. As Ino was being led away from the arena, the girl found herself wondering if she knew Sakura anymore, as her former friend had changed a great deal in the months since she had last seen her. Someone had apparently replaced the somewhat insecure girl she had known with a competent kunoichi while she hadn't been looking. The girl whom she had expected to fall to her might had instead risen to the challenge, and taken the advantage presented to her when she had rather stupidly pulled one of her punches, believing Sakura to still be as weak as she used to be. Thanks to that pulled punch, she had been steadily driven into a corner by the girl's furious onslaught which had followed, until she had eventually fallen. After years of winning in just about every arena other than love, she had finally lost to Sakura. Kakashi proudly greeted Sakura after she'd returned from her fight with the Yamanaka girl. Despite their differences, his team had performed admirably so far. They had managed to work together long enough to make their way through the forest to the tower, and all three of them had passed the preliminary matches, advancing to the next round. He was slightly worried about Sasuke though. The boy obviously had some anger issues. Using a jutsu like the Ryuka no Jutsu in a preliminary bout had been overkill, especially since he already had his opponent on the ropes and pretty much defeated when he used it, making its use highly unnecessary. Naruto had of course performed admirably as always, just as his father would have done. The boy had used excellent strategies to take out the Inuzuka's greatest advantages and carry the day. He would not have expected any less of Minato-sensei's son. In her recent battle, Sakura had somehow managed to surprise him as well. The girl had grown greatly over the last couple of months. The student he had thought the weakest and least likely to succeed had managed to defeat the daughter of the head of the Yamanaka family. Not only had she managed to defeat the girl, she had defeated her soundly. He probably wasn't going to forget that rather vicious bit of hair-pulling she had engaged in order to win anytime soon though. Fortunately for Sakura, Naruto had convinced her to pin her hair up and cover it for the exams. Only 4 bouts into the preliminaries, and he could already brag that his entire team had passed into the finals. Not bad. It would be even better if Guy's team didn't pass though. He'd be able to hold it over the man's head for years if that happened. Chapter 21, Chunin Exams, Preliminaries 2. As soon as Sakura and Ino cleared out of the arena, the names for the 5th fight in the preliminaries were called and Kankuro and Akato Yoroi made their way down to the arena. Kankuro had rather cleverly in his opinion switched himself out with Karasu when everyone had been paying attention to the bitch fight between the 2 leaf kunoichi that had been passed off as a preliminary bout, and therefore was being carried into the arena rather than walking. Soon, Yoroi and Karasu were standing in front of the proctor who was refereeing the preliminaries waiting for their fight to start. The moment the signal was given, both Karasu and Yoroi burst into motion. Yoroi grabbed the only bit on Karasu that would have been exposed skin on Kankuro, his face. Despite his facial covering that masked all expression, the man somehow managed to look completely stunned when absolutely nothing happened after he grabbed Kankuro's face. Whatever the man had planned to do had apparently required physical contact with the real Kankuro in order for him to pull it off. Following Yoroi's failure, Karasu went on the offensive and beat Yoroi to a pulp at Kankuro's direction. Kankuro found the fight to be easy, and was amused by the fact that he'd never once been forced to show himself throughout the entire bout. Apparently, his opponent had been a one-trick pony, and he'd somehow neutralized the trick without even trying. As soon as the proctor announced his victory, he swapped places with Karasu, and made his way back to Baki-sensei and his siblings. There was no reason to remain wrapped in those stifling bandages any longer than necessary. Practically the instant Kankuro returned to his teammates, the names for the 6th bout were announced. Temari would be fighting someone named Tenten. As she made her way down to the arena and proctor who would start the match, Temari sized her opponent up. The girl looked more serious than her other Konoha counterparts, and obviously hadn't spent as much time on her hair and clothing as that ridiculous pair, who had been clawing at each other and trying to pull the other's hair had done. Good, this might actually be a real match, rather than a bitch fight like the one that had taken place between the two other Leaf Kunoichi. In the opening moves of their fight, her opponent showed herself to be something of a budding weapons specialist when she went on the offensive. It was such a pity that she had to come up against a wind mistress considering. Unlike just about every other girl in Konoha that she'd encountered during her stay, the girl actually seemed to take her position as a kunoichi seriously. She would rather have seen her in the final phase of the exams than that pink-haired harridan who spent a good minute pulling that blonde's hair. When the girl realized that her initial moves had failed, and that she would need to step up her game, she released 3 storage scrolls worth of weapons, and did something with ninja wire that undoubtedly would have caught Kankuro's interest as a puppet master before the bout was over. But eventually the fight ended in her favor as she blew the last of the weapons away, and caught the girl in a Kamaitashi no Jutsu, which was rather aptly named after the sickle weasel which floated through the wind, slicing anyone it encountered with its razor-sharp claws according to legend. After catching the wounded girl on her fan, she flicked her aside, and one of the boys on her team jumped down and caught her before she hit the ground. After the boy had caught his teammate, she talked a bit of trash with the boy she could be battling in a month, and left the arena. While she had a little more respect for her opponent than she did the 2 other kunoichi she had seen battle, she still found the Leaf Kunoichi to be weak compared to her. She had hoped for a greater challenge than the one she had gotten, only to have those hopes dashed. Considering the apparent strength of the Leaf's forces, when it came time for the invasion, Konoha was going to be toast. As soon as Tenten's weapons were all cleared from the arena floor, the names for the 7th bout were selected and announced. Lee wasn't sure if he should be happy or disappointed that he had been selected to fight Akimichi Chuji. While the Akimichi were powerhouses when it came to taijutsu, the heavy boy was both slower and less experienced than him, thus the disappointment. The potential joy over the selection of his opponent came from the fact that he would have a much better chance of advancing to the finals and facing a truly strong opponent during the 3rd phase of the exams in front of all of the dignitaries that the Hokage had mentioned, proving that a genius of hard work could succeed. The battle that came next was short and almost brutally one-sided, as even with the weights holding him back, he moved far too quickly for Chuji to counter. Chuji's punches and kicks were undoubtedly powerful, as was his human bullet tank technique, but he had been able to rather easily avoid them, and kicking Chuji around like he was a soccer ball had not been nearly as fun as it had apparently looked to his audience, who had cheered when Chuji had hit the far wall of the arena. He had been hoping for a most youthful battle in which both parties gave their all, but it looked like he would have to wait until the 3rd phase for that to happen. As soon as Lee and the rather battered Chuji were cleared from the arena floor, the names for the 8th bout were announced. They were Hyuga Hinata and Hyuga Niji. Hinata, who had been over the moon about the fact that Naruto was actually speaking with her, even if it was only about the properties of the homemade medicinal ointment that she had given him, had been forcefully slammed down to earth by the name of her opponent. That couldn't possibly have been a random selection. Someone had to have bribed whoever it was that programmed the boards, either that, or a Hyuga had programmed the board at some point when it became apparent that preliminaries would be necessary. She understood why it had been done. Compared to Niji and her younger sister, she was weak. If she somehow made it to the final part of the exams and failed in front of the assembled dignitaries, her family would be seen as weak. By having her fight Niji and be eliminated now, it was guaranteed that a Hyuga would make it to the final phase, and not shame the family when they did so. She felt sadness and anger at this. She had worked so hard to be strong, and had hoped to prove to herself and everyone around her that she was so during the Chunin exams. She had always wanted to be like Naruto, who always picked himself back up off the ground and climbed ever higher after every time he did so. Every time she faced an obstacle, however, she found herself stopping and backing away. This time didn't appear to be an exception, as while Niji kept telling her that she was a failure and always would be a failure, she found herself drawing in on herself, trying to protect herself from his words. Suddenly, as she was about to give up, a voice that never failed to cause her heart to skip a beat called out, "Come on, Hinata, don't give up now. I know for a fact that you're much better than this." Naruto believed in her. Naruto believed in her. She couldn't give up now, she had to prove to both herself and everyone else that she was as strong as Naruto believed her to be. Emboldened by the words of the boy she admired, she moved to strike. Niji provided no openings, no matter what she did, however. Eventually, after what seemed like forever, her eyes found one. She scored a hit. She scored a hit against Niji. She could do this. She couldn't do this. Niji proved too strong and too fast. He closed all of the tenketsu on her arms, disabling her juken strikes. All she could do now was try to block him. She couldn't block him forever, and the pain in her chest from one of his earlier strikes grew to be too much. She collapsed and nearly lost consciousness. As the proctor announced her defeat, and the jounin moved in to save her from Niji's next attack, she struggled to rise. She wouldn't stay down. She wouldn't stay down. She would get up like Naruto. She stood, and then she fell. Naruto clutched the railing in shock. If he had known that this would happen, he would not have called out any encouragement despite the fact that he'd promised Hinata that he'd be rooting for her as she left for the arena floor. He had seen Hinata faltering, and decided then would be a good time to cheer her up a bit, especially since he now considered her to be something of a friend now that he'd actually talked to her. After he'd loudly cheered her on, Hinata had fought instead of forfeiting like she had looked like she had been about to do. She had fought bravely, and now, because she had fought, she could die. Niji, however, had not needed to be so brutal. He had not needed to put Hinata down so much, and he had not needed to attack her so viciously, especially considering the fact that Hinata was both family and a comrade to the Hyuga boy. Hinata was his friend, and as soon as he got a chance to do so, he was going to show Niji exactly what he did to people who harmed his friends. If Hinata's teammates didn't take him out back and show him what they did to people who hurt their teammate first, that is. As her teammates, the Inuzuka and the Aburame had first dibs on any actions that might be taken against the Hyuga bastard for what he'd done to Hinata. As she was carried off, Niji watched his cousin, who persisted in calling him big brother despite the fact that he had done everything to make it clear that he disliked her, go. She had proven herself a loser as fate had decreed her to be, but as he looked back on the fight, he remembered the moment that her eyes had changed, and how there had been steel in her spine if only for a little while. In that moment, she had seemed strong and fierce, and traces of that fierceness had remained in the moments afterward when she refused to quit even though it was obvious from the beginning that she had lost, and in the moment, she rose despite the fact that she should have stayed down. She had lost as fate decreed she would, however. People don't change. Once a loser, always a loser. There were no exceptions. As soon as Niji walked away confident in his understanding of how the world worked, the 9th match was called, and it was Nara Shikamaru and Tsuchi-kin who would be fighting in this bout. Shikamaru wouldn't have bothered, except that it would be more troublesome for him if he backed out now, since he had failed to back out when he'd been given the chance to do so. If he just stayed up here now, he'd be hearing about it from his peers, his teammates, his mother, and Asuma-sensei for years. Whether he won or lost, it would be better to just get it over and done with now so he wouldn't have to hear anything about it from anyone. Kin proved to be an interesting if somewhat easy to read opponent. After determining the nature of her sound-based Jinjutsu attack, he swiftly caught her in his cage main, and made her knock herself out by hitting her head against a nearby wall while dodging a flying shuriken. Now that was over and done with, he couldn't wait for the 10th battle to take place, so he could get the hell out of here, and maybe catch some cloud watching time before the team went out for Chuji's consolation dinner. After the unconscious Kin had been cleared away, the 10th match was called, and it was Gaara against Tsurugi Misumi. As Misumi made his way down to the arena, he wondered exactly how hard a time he would have of it. Kabuto had informed him of Gaara's status as the Jinchuriki of the one-tailed Tanuki Shikaku. This meant that in regards to power, his opponent was stronger than the average jounin, and he would have to end this quickly. Trying to get the fight over with as fast as possible, he moved to the boy the instant the start of the fight was called, and dislocated his limbs so the boy couldn't just throw him off when he wrapped himself around him as he did so. When he grabbed the boy in order to squeeze him to death or unconsciousness at the very least, it had probably looked like a weird sort of hug to everyone who had been watching, since he'd gone for the front as the boy's back was covered by a giant gourd. As he tried to crush the boy, he could feel sand move under his arms. Suddenly, he felt himself flying away from the boy, his limbs ripping off and going in different directions as sand flew into his face, blinding him. There was more pain than he'd ever felt in his entire life, and everything went black. After the 10th bout had ended and those who passed had lined up before him, Gecko Hayate looked over the group of genin, who had made it to the third phase of the exams. They were a strong bunch, and would most likely go far. Soon, the Hokage finished his speech to the young shinobi that were arrayed before him, and he went along the line with the box that contained the numbered slips of paper that would determine in which order the genin would fight. Once he reached the end and the last number had been taken, the candidates called out their numbers. 1. Hyuga Niji called. 5. Aburame Shino called. 3. Rock Lee called. 4. The Suna Genin Kankuro called. 2. Uzumaki Naruto called. 7. The Suna Genin Temari called. 6. Narashikamaru called. 9. Uchiha Sasuke called. 10. The Suna Genin Gaara called. 8. Haruno Sakura called. The matches for the third phase of the summer Chunin exams will be Hyuga Niji vs Uzumaki Naruto, Rock Lee vs Kankuro, Aburame Shino vs Narashikamaru, Temari vs Haruno Sakura, and Uchiha Sasuke vs Gaara. He announced after the last genin had called out her number. After the matches had been called, the preliminaries had ended and everyone including Kakashi had gone home. As he made his way into his apartment and tossed his vest onto a chair that was completely covered in dog hair, Kakashi sighed in relief that ordeal was over. A moment later, he whirled and pulled out a kunai as he made his way to his minuscule kitchen to attack the person who was sitting at his dining table without his leave. He then lowered the kunai when he saw exactly who it was that was sitting at his table leafing through one of his few non-Ika books and chowing down on the leftovers he'd planned on having for dinner. "Hello Jiraiya," he said. "Long time no see." Chapter 22, Chunin Exams, Trainers and Students. After greeting his sensei, Kakashi pulled a beer out of his fridge and popped it open, wondering what the hell Jiraiya was doing in his kitchen after staying away from Konoha and everyone in it for more than a decade. After several moments of thought, it finally hit him. "You're taking Naruto, aren't you?" he asked, holding the open beer 2 inches away from his masked face, unheeding of the fact that it had begun to spill. "I had planned on it, yes," Jiraiya replied, and in that moment, he felt an almost uncontrollable urge to murder his sensei. Under Konoha law, he could get away with it too, since the man had invaded his apartment uninvited. "You do realize that I don't plan on handing him over," he told the man who had come into his home, eaten his dinner, and told him that he planned on taking Minato-sensei's son from him coldly. He knew that Jiraiya had the prior claim since he was the boy's godfather, appointed to the position by Minato-sensei and all. He even knew why the man had not fulfilled his responsibilities towards the boy until now, as it was the same reason he had hung back until Shimura had given him a legitimate reason to come forward. Even with that knowledge, the thought of the man taking Naruto away from him before he had a chance to connect with the boy enraged him. "You do realize that you don't have a choice, much like that one guy what's-his-name didn't have a choice when you took Naruto from him?" Jiraiya replied equally coolly, the look in his eyes saying that if he tried to force the issue, he would smack him down hard. "Naruto was meant to be," he started. "Naruto was meant to be his student." He had known that since the day he had first felt the boy kick while Kushina-san was pregnant with him. He'd almost forgotten it in the intervening years, but he had remembered when Shimura had taken the boy for himself. "With you, yes I know," Jiraiya said. "You clearly illustrated that when you took him without ever once consulting the boy about his feelings on the matter. He'll come around eventually," he replied. Naruto would come around eventually, even if he had to wait a long while. Naruto was his to train, his to mold as Minato-sensei had once done with him. He'd promised Minato-sensei well before Naruto was even born. Would you have come around if someone had snatched you from little Minato and demanded you call them sensei? Jiraiya asked, pushing his half-finished meal aside and looking at him seriously. That is hardly the... He started before Jiraiya cut him off again. It is the same. You took him away from a teacher he knew and loved just like family, and tried to take the man's role even though Naruto hadn't wanted you to. Jiraiya replied. I may have been far away, but I've always had eyes and ears on the boy. You plan on doing the same thing. He pointed out, as Jiraiya had already admitted to as much earlier. Not exactly. Jiraiya replied. While I do plan on springing a little surprise on the boy, I'm going to make it clear that I know that his sensei is his sensei, and that his godfather can teach him a few tricks that his sensei doesn't know. If he tries to shove me off and tell me to go to hell, I'll back off him a bit and give him a little time and space. If you keep trying to squeeze him tighter, he's just going to struggle that much harder to escape. He scowled at this behind his mask. Jiraiya always knew how to make him feel like a kid, and he felt very much like one later, after he'd chucked his half-full beer at the man and yelled at him to get out. It figured. Everyone else had been taken from him, so why not Naruto? The morning after the preliminaries, Naruto arrived at Team 7's meeting point as Kakashi had ordered in the missive that Pakken had arrived with earlier that morning. Sakura and then Sasuke showed up about a minute later coming from two different directions, indicating that Sakura hadn't gone through her usual morning stalking routine that morning. Kakashi showed up 2 hours late as usual. The fact that the man looked hungover was not normal, however. Before Kakashi could say a word, however, Konohamaru's tutor bounded onto the scene. Sorry I'm late, the man whose name he thought might be Ebisu said. The honorable grandson somehow managed to paint the Hokage's office orange, and the lecture I gave him ran longer than I had planned. The look on Kakashi's face at this statement was absolutely murderous. The reason why I called you here today, Kakashi said once Ebisu had settled himself well away from the man who was quite possibly going to be having words with him later, is because I have had to arrange alternate instruction, since I cannot train all three of you for the third phase of the exams. There were 2 potential instructors, and 3 of them. That meant... Yes. He was getting back with Tetsuo-sensei, finally. Ebisu here will be taking Sasuke. Kamizuki Suzume has agreed to train Sakura, and I will be taking Naruto. Kakashi finished. What? But Kakashi. He started. He had to act fast, or his chance to spend a month with Tetsuo-sensei would be gone. He would have to think of an argument quick. What is it, Naruto? Kakashi asked. Wouldn't it make more sense for you to take Sasuke? He asked, having gotten his inspiration from the horrified look Sasuke had given Konohamaru's tutor. Both of you have the Sharingan, and Sasuke is a lightning affinity like you as well. Not only that, but Sasuke will be going up against a rather dangerous Earth user who ripped that one guy apart. That does make sense, Naruto, but... Kakashi started, clearly not willing to let him go. It was going to take a long argument to get rid of the man, and Sasuke really did need the training, so he wasn't entirely doing this for selfish reasons. While Team 7 met, Inuzuka Kiba sat at Hinata's bedside as he had done for the past hour and a half. The medics had had to restart her heart twice since the preliminaries. Somehow, Hinata had managed to pull through though, and was in the ICU instead of the morgue. He had come to visit the instant the hospital allowed it, despite the fact that the girl was unconscious, and he would stay by his teammate's bedside until she got better. He had nothing else to do, and even if he did have something else to do, he would still have visited. It was a pity that Niji was untouchable at the moment due to the exams. If he tried to do anything to the other boy, Shino could be disqualified, because of his interference since he was Shino's teammate. This little fact was only just barely holding him back from going up to Niji and ripping his balls off though. If Shino didn't get the bastard during the exams, he was going to murder him afterward. Guy didn't know why he even bothered lecturing Niji about his unyouthful, and frankly somewhat psychotic actions during the preliminaries. The boy obviously hadn't been listening to him. Niji rarely listened to him when he tried to give him advice, unlike Lee. Lee was the perfect student and quite possibly a distant relative. Lee had been a great deal like him as a child. A hard-working boy who was called a loser and determined to prove he wasn't. Lee had put in all the hard work to get where he was today, obsessively training day after day after day. All of that hard work was finally starting to pay off for Lee, just as it had for him when he was Lee's age. A month from now, Lee would be proving to everyone that a person could be an exemplary shinobi with taijutsu alone. Until that day came, he would train with Lee to prepare him for his coming ordeal, and try to figure out what he was going to do with Niji, who would be training with his clan during the upcoming month. Niji would have to be dealt with soon, however, since his being perceived as the sort who would attack comrades could completely ruin his career as a shinobi, and the whispers about what he had done to his cousin Hinata were already beginning to spread. The fact that his final attack took place after the fight had been declared over, and the fact that the Hinata girl was family wasn't doing his student any favors either. Back at the Hyuga compound, Hyuga Hayashi watched the video of the fight between his eldest daughter and his brother's son. He had been advised of Hinata's condition as a result of that fight earlier when he had gone to visit his daughter at the hospital. Hinata had always been weak, and while he told himself it would be no great loss if she passed, and that it would solve the problem of who would be his heir, seeing her like that had hurt him deeply. She looked so much like her mother had in her final moments. Turning his attention to the video, he watched in surprise as the trembling and weak creature he knew suddenly grew determined and began to battle her older cousin despite knowing the outcome in advance. He grew even more surprised when the girl rose after she lost, despite the fact that she had to be in almost unbearable agony, and was quite likely suffering from a heart attack at that time. It would seem that Hinata wasn't so weak after all. Jiraiya observed his future apprentice from a distance as the boy argued with little Kakashi. He would have to find the most opportune time for them to meet, the time when his student's son would be most inclined to accept his assistance. He couldn't just outright introduce himself as the boy's godfather, as that would raise some questions that he couldn't answer right now thanks to a set of orders he'd received from his sensei long ago. The fact that the boy knew a little bit about his mother might help answer some of those questions though, as he had become the child's godfather with his mother's consent. Hiruzen sensei had sent him periodic updates on the boy while he'd been away from the village, so he knew much of what had been going on in the child's life over the years. He had also managed to send 1 or 2 presents to the child that he was certain couldn't be tracked back to him over the years as well. Now, once he found the opportune moment, he was going to be directly interacting with Naruto for the first time since he had been a newborn. As she left with Ebisu, Sakura honestly didn't know how the hell Naruto did it. Now, instead of 1 trainer for the 3rd phase of the exams, she now had 3. Suzume, who had been working with her for the past couple of months, an elite tutor named Ebisu, who had owed Kakashi a favor, and possibly Kurenai, who apparently would be having some free time on her hands if what Ebisu said when he mentioned the possibility of calling her in was true. What had happened was that Naruto had somehow managed to talk Kakashi into taking Sasuke as his student, and somehow managed to fast-talk Ebisu into taking her on at some point during the argument as well. The next thing she knew was that Ebisu had taken her off to evaluate her skills, and had mentioned bringing in an acquaintance of his on occasion to possibly tutor her in Genjutsu since she had almost perfect chakra control. All of these people who had arranged for her training and had been willing to train her obviously thought that she would succeed, otherwise they would not have decided to spend time working with her. She would have to do so in order to make sure that their time wasn't wasted. Despite the pressure this added, she would not let them down. Sasuke growled as he packed enough supplies for a month-long trip after returning home from his team meeting. Kakashi was going to be taking him out for special training, but he was only doing it because that boy hadn't wanted the man to be training him. He remembered the look of panic on that boy's face when he started arguing for Kakashi to take him instead. As far as Kakashi was concerned, he was something to be thrown aside, and that boy was the real prize. He didn't know why since he disliked the man, but that realization really stung for some strange reason. Tetsuo had been about to lay his daughter down for a nap when he heard the excited pounding on the door. He went to open it, and found a very welcome visitor on the doorstep. "Hello Tetsuo-sensei," Naruto said, grinning from ear to ear. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.